Jujutsu Kaisen is a series that, following its explosive battles, cursed philosophy, and some of the most popular male characters in modern shonen, has amassed quite a bit of criticism. And while there might be plenty of that to go around, today, I want to talk about the women, not necessarily to criticize how they were written, but to mourn what they could have been if the story had allowed them to finish their character arcs before getting emotionally sidelined, violently exploded, or casually erased from the plot. Because here's my probably controversial opinion. Characters like Nobara and Maki had significantly more storytelling potential than some of their counterparts in popular shonen anime, which are actually praised for their female cast, like Fullmetal Alchemist. And before you come at me with pitchforks, let me explain what I mean by contrasting the notion of well-written characters with limited potential to characters who stumble in their roles while wearing some pretty big shoes. Take Fullmetal Alchemist Winry and Riza, for example. Both are beloved, and for good reason. They're consistent, grounded, and emotionally impactful. But their purpose in the story is tightly woven around the Eric brothers and Roy Mustang. Winry is the heart-tethering head to his humanity. Riza is the quiet moral compass that guides Mustang. But ask yourself this. If we pull the camera fully onto Winry or Riza, do they have the narrative fuel to carry a hero's journey all on their own? I don't see it. And that's not a flaw, it's a design choice. Winry and Riza are stable by design. They don't need to change much to fulfill their purpose within the story. Their growth is quiet, internal, but mostly adjacent to someone else's spotlight. Now, when I say a character has potential, I mean that within the narrative setup they've been given, their background, goals, their obstacles, they could easily be conceived as the protagonist of their own similarly themed story. The creator has given us enough to ground them to the central elements of the world created, so that we may imagine an alternative story where we'd be watching a full hero's journey unfold through their eyes. They have the internal conflict, the call to adventure, the trials and transformations. Basically, they're built for a classic arc. The only thing missing is narrative priority and the story not making them stall out mid-arc. And that's Nobara and Maki. They were positioned to evolve, their stories teach transformation, challenge, and emotional rupture, the stuff you would expect of protagonists. The issue isn't that they failed, it's that the narrative, along the way, forgot to let them try. Brief pause before going any further for a quick PSA. This analysis will contain spoilers for the first 2 seasons of the JJK anime, plus the JJK Zero movie. There will be a part at the end where I will address the later developments in the manga, but I will be sure to warn beforehand so that anyone who doesn't want to be spoiled may skip it. Now let's start talking about Nobara Kugisaki, the girl boss with a hammer who had so much more to offer. Nobara starts off with a setup that could suggest a quietly compelling background. She comes from a closed-off, traditional rural community, one that clearly didn't understand her, most likely didn't encourage her individuality, and probably whispered behind her back when she tried to be anything other than conventional. Her attachment to Saori, someone who comes from outside the confines of her small corner of the universe, says everything. Saori wasn't just a friend. She was most likely a symbol, an image Nobara could aspire to, a representative of the outside world she wants to escape to. So, when Nobara decides to become a sorcerer, it's not just about exercising curses. It's an act of rebellion and a declaration of autonomy. She's basically saying, I'm going to live life on my terms, even if I die doing it. Now that is the classic hero's call to action, updated for the modern age with a bit of existential spite. Her personality is sharp, loud, occasionally abrasive, which frankly makes a lot of sense. When you've spent your formative years being diminished, you'll sometimes respond by doubling down on being seen. She's not trying to be likable, she's trying to be undeniable. Ultimately, beneath that bravado, what we discover is quite a bit of emotional repression. We know she feels deeply, we see it in the way she connects to Yuji, to Maki, but she hates vulnerability. She hides it behind sarcasm and self-confidence because in her world, softness gets punished. Even her debut moment tells us she's not who she pretends to be. When she risks her life to save a child from a curse, even though her instincts, as well as basic logic, tell her to be selfish, she makes the classic reluctant hero move. Her actions reveal that she is a bit of an unreliable narrator. The way she presents herself might not be entirely who she is. a detail which usually holds the promise of a journey of revelation and transformation to come. A key moment for this is in the last episode of Season 1 during the discussion with Yuji, when she shares her life philosophy. And I quote, "If I think of my life as a bus ride, I don't want to get my heart swayed by someone who shouldn't have had a seat in the first place. But then sometimes there are people like you who bring their own seat and just sit right down." End quote. I think it's telling that in her seat metaphor, she's trying to hold on to the mask of the cold and detached person by assigning the responsibility onto someone else. She's basically telling Yuji, "I did not choose to care for you. You simply did not give me a choice." And let's talk about her relationship with Maki for a second. Nobara clearly admires her, not just because Maki's a badass, and she is, but because they share a similar scar, being rejected by their roots. Nobara sees in Maki the person she wants to become. Strong, unapologetic, and thriving despite being dismissed. So what do we have so far? Strong motivation, emotional complexity, a central internal conflict between pride and vulnerability, an actual respectably unique curse technique that contributes to key battles. And thematically, she fits perfectly into Jujutsu Kaisen's bigger ideas. How young sorcerers are treated as disposable weapons, how personal agency is crushed under tradition, how strength and identity are constantly negotiated in the face of institutional rot. What could go wrong, you say? Well, at about this point the story said, what if we didn't follow through with any of that? Enter Shibuya, the arc where everything's changed for everyone, but for Nobara and her journey, not in a good way. First, we get that added flashback with Fumi. And let's be honest here, it's just fine, I guess, somewhat, maybe, I don't know. Some mild bullying, some vague melancholy, nothing that deepens what we already knew. In fact, it kind of flattens her. It reframes her motivation not as a deep internal fight for identity and freedom, but as a reaction to some very average social rejection. It shrinks her arc instead of expanding it. Think of the thematic possibilities if the story had expanded Nobara's background, diving deeper into how closed-off, traditional communities often breed prejudice and exclude those who are different. People like those who can see curses, people like Jujutsu sorcerers. Sound familiar? It echoes that pivotal moment when Geto decided to annihilate an entire village for ignorantly blaming and abusing two girls whose only crime was being different. It would have been a clear tie-in to the story's broader themes, and a huge missed opportunity to better explore, later on, the moral ambiguities that come with succumbing to your own frustrations in the face of an unfair reality. And then, just as she's beginning to get a crucial moment, boom, gone. Taken out in a pretty abrupt exit, just as she was battling an important villain. Not with a resolution, not with a revelation, just, oops, she's dead now, maybe, we're not sure. Anyway, on to the next guy fight. Before going any further, just a quick observation that if you've made it this far, you clearly like overthinking anime as much as I do, so maybe stick around? The subscribe button could help you get notified when I decide to go down the next rabbit hole. Now that we've gotten the shameless self-promotion out of the way, let's turn to Maki Zenin and her journey. Maki's story begins with rejection, not of the world, but by her own family. The Zenin clan, famously cursed with traditionalism and internal misogyny, viewed her as worthless from birth. Why? Because she was born with no cursed energy, and in a world where Jujutsu prestige is passed down through bloodline, being seemingly powerless was the ultimate shame. And she didn't just get sidelined, she got actively shunned, bullied, used as a servant. It's the classic thrown out of the castle myth, except instead of swearing revenge, Maki committed herself to something even more dangerous. Independence through pure strength. She walks away from the clan and declares she'll become a Jujutsu sorcerer anyway, on her own terms, with no blessings, no magic, no inherited technique fanfare, just grit, glasses, and an absolutely ridiculous talent with cursed tools. And that's kind of poetic. She's the best with cursed tools, not because of some destiny or miracle, but because she has to be. There's no fallback plan. Maki isn't just skilled, she's forged her own body into a weapon. When others wield power, she is power that is sharpened by spite, tempered by rejection. And I find it to be such a breath of fresh air to have in a story where characters' abilities are 80% inherited, someone who stands out through good old-fashioned grind. Well, at least at the beginning. Now, this idea of rejecting her family is also carried through in something small but powerful. She distances herself from her last name. There's a moment early on where she chastises Megumi for using her last name. It's not her trying to be casual, it's a deliberate severing of identity. The Zenin name holds no pride for her, it's not who she is, it's what she escaped. And yet, the wound still shows. Despite her stoic, no-nonsense demeanor, which often gets her labeled as a cold-hearted demon, Maki is still very much in conversation with her past. Her desire to become a grade 1 sorcerer isn't just ambition, it's defiance. She wants to spite the people who told her she'd never amount to anything. But ironically, that means they're still dictating her goals. She's trying to win a race they defined. She's not free of the Zenin, not yet. We see flickers of this vulnerability most clearly in her interactions with Yuta, when she gets visibly uncomfortable talking about cursed energy. It's not just awkwardness, it's insecurity. She's used to compensating, to hiding the gap with skill and attitude. But cursed energy, that's a conversation that puts her back in the deficient box, and she hates that box. And then there's Mai. One of the most emotionally complicated parts of Maki's arc is her relationship with her twin sister. When Maki left the clan, she didn't just leave the name, she left Mai behind. And Mai resents her for that. She stayed, she endured, she chose survival over rebellion. Maki, on the other hand, chose identity over comfort. She chose selfhood at the cost of connection. And that choice hurts. You can see it in the icy exchange between the two of them, in the way they look at each other or the way Mai lashes out. And the sad thing is, they were both victims of the same system. If you were to imagine a story centered on Maki's journey, and it isn't that hard to imagine, her arc would be one of internal liberation. From the need to prove herself, from the weight of the family legacy. She has the perfect hero's journey set up. Cast out of home, trained in exile, haunted by a rival-turned sister, armed with nothing but determination and a blade. Honestly, makes me think of a sort of Kill Bill meets Greek tragedy kind of scenario. But like Nobara, Maki's arc starts strong and then gets choppy. And this is where I pause to say, manga spoilers ahead. For the next 3 minutes, I will be discussing key moments from the manga, so feel free to jump ahead if you do not wish to be spoiled. Her growth spikes in the Zenin massacre arc, where she pretty much burns down the house and slaughters her clan. And while that moment is raw and cathartic, it also feels like the ending of someone else's story, not hers. Because after that, her narrative flattens out. She becomes more of a supporting tank than a complex character. The emotional tension disappears, the internal conflict vanishes, or at the very least is thoroughly ignored. The girl who wanted to prove her worth is now a walking sword who's already proven everything. And that leaves no room for the messy, beautiful process of healing. My sacrifice, while beautiful and even a bit poetic, also undermines another possible route for organic character growth. The inhuman strength Maki achieves after losing the little cursed energy she had along with her sister's life doesn't really feel like an earned achievement. It feels more like something conveniently granted by the plot. And while sure, that's common within the JJK world, it would have been satisfying to see at least one standout character who grows through old-fashioned effort and determination. And that's not all. Besides inner character growth, this particular arc had the potential to tie in and build on the story's broader world. For Maki, a story could have been told where she reshapes the Jujutsu world's rotten clan system. After her dramatic awakening and clan purge, it would have been absurd to think she might assume leadership of a reformed Zenin clan, or even help abolish the corrupt sorcerer hierarchy. There was also excitement to explore Maki's emotional journey, how she'd cope with Mai's death, and what it truly meant for her to have freedom afterwards. And that's the missed opportunity. Imagine if we had stayed with her post-massacre, if the story had explored what it meant to finally get revenge and feel nothing, if we had followed her as she tried to rebuild her identity outside of rebellion. to rediscover what she wants for herself, not just what she wants to destroy. Maki could have been a protagonist with a deep emotional journey, one of self-reclamation, of making peace with pain, or redefining strength without needing to be invincible. Instead, she gets sidelined, again. And isn't that the final irony? That the girl who fought her whole life to not be erased ends up partially sidelined by the very story she's in. Speaking of being sidelined, remember Nobara? Well, it turns out she wasn't actually dead. Probably not a surprise to many, though having her tucked away until the very last minute probably wasn't on most people's bingo cards either. No development, barely any grieving from her friends. Though to be fair, they don't seem to grieve much in the world of JJK. Must be all that cursed energy. When she finally does reappear at the very end, she feels less like a character and more like a narrative band-aid. A Deus Ex hammer, if you will. And that letter from Gojo, where we learn he may have tracked down her mom and she just shrugs it off? To be fair, so did the readers probably. Who the heck is her mother and why bring her up last minute anyway? The problem is that instead of her reckoning with her past she ran from, we get a scene that plays like Gege Akutami writing, I don't know, LOL, in the margins of her character sheet. And honestly, Gege Akutami has been pretty upfront about his writing process. In his own words, from the postscript of JJK0, begin quote, "When I start a manga series, I don't really have a theme in mind. I begin by thinking about things like, this twist would be interesting, or these characters might be cool, or this scene would be amazing. I think in general terms when coming up with a story. I've already decided on the final chapter's content, as well as several things that will happen along the way. However, I still don't know how these dots will connect. I hope everything will turn out okay, but will I be able to finish it?" End quote. And it's a philosophy that explains a lot. Why genuinely great setups like Nobara or Maki's arc can end up with underwhelming or incomplete execution. Because what comes between the premise and the ending, what we usually call the journey, that's what journey makes or breaks a story. And themes, as well as thematic coherence, is pretty integral to that process. Both Nobara and Maki had all the pieces of a traditional hero's journey, but if you look at which steps were actually fulfilled, it's only half lit. The departure, some trials, they're there. The transformation, the return, the resolution, they don't shine so bright. And that's the bittersweet thing about JJK's women. They're not badly written, they're half-written. They stride into the story with a spark of co-leads, only for the spotlight to wander off mid-arc, leaving us with outlines where a full portrait could have been. They remain what I like to call protagonists in exile, which, in keeping with the theme, is probably the most cursed fate of all.